Research Foundation monthly Meet the Scientist webinar. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein, President and CEO of the Foundation, and your host and moderator for today's webinar. Today, Dr. Dennis Charney, a distinguished member of our Scientific Council, will present a webinar entitled Resilience, the Science of Mastering Life's Greatest Challenges. The Brain and Behavior Research Foundation is dedicated to funding research around the world to identify the causes, improve treatments, and ultimately develop cures and preventative techniques for mental illness. The Foundation has awarded close to $300 million in research grants over 25 years. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Dennis Charney. Dr. Charney is the Dean at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs at the Mount Sinai Medical Center, and Professor of the Departments of Psychiatry, Neuroscience, and Pharmacology and Systems Therapeutics. Dr. Charney is a world expert in the neurobiology and treatment of mood and anxiety disorders. He has made fundamental contributions to the understanding of the causes of human anxiety, fear, and depression, as well as the neurobiology of resilience to stress, and his work has led to the development of novel therapies for treatment-resistant depression. Dr. Charney's 20 years of research with trauma survivors has culminated in the identification of 10 key resilience factors. This webinar is a reflection of his inspiring new book, Resilience, the Science of Mastering Life's Greatest Challenges, co-authored with Stephen Southwick. Dr. Charney is a recipient of a NARSAD Distinguished Investigator Grant in 2007 and has been a member of the Foundation Scientific Council since 1999. This will be an interactive event. We'll start with Dr. Charney's presentation, followed by a question and answer period. To submit your questions, please use the Questions tab of the webinar control panel. You can submit your questions throughout the presentation. As your moderator, I will present your questions to Dr. Charney, and we will address as many as possible. We will also be tweeting at #BrainWebinar if you'd like to join the tweet conversation. And now I'm pleased to present Dr. Dennis Charney.
Thank you, Jeff. And it's a real pleasure to talk to all the folks on the webinar about our research over the last 20 years. And let me start by giving you a bit of background about the research. My colleagues and I at Yale and at Mount Sinai and the National Institute of Health for many years have been studying post-traumatic stress disorder in veterans from different wars and women who've unfortunately experienced physical and sexual abuse, people who had to face serious medical problems and so forth, and have identified over the years different causes of post-traumatic stress disorder and the biologic basis of PTSD. But about 15 or so years ago, particularly my colleague Steve Southwick and I, wondered whether we could learn a lot from individuals who were resilient. In other words, they had been traumatized in some way, but had either never developed post-traumatic stress disorder or depression or substance abuse as a result of the trauma, or if they had developed a condition like that, they were able to recover. They were able to bounce back. So we wondered if we got to know a lot of such individuals, would they give us clues to what's the basis of resilience psychologically in terms of development and personality, the biology of resilience, and whether or not that could inform us in terms of developing new ways of treating post-traumatic stress disorder and depression. So what I'm going to review with you today is basically a story of our research over the last 15 or 20 years. And what I hope you get out of the lecture are several things that are illustrated on this slide. One is that psychological stress can alter brain function. I'll be reviewing that at the end of my presentation. Two, that we begin to uncover the psychobiologic mechanisms of human resilience to stress. What are the key factors related to resilience? Three, that you can train yourself to become a more resilient person. And this could have implications for your patients, but I hope also many of you may find this informative for your own life, because at some point all of us develop challenges that we must overcome. So let me start by introducing some of the people that we met along the way, resilient people. And what's pictured on this slide is Jerry White. Jerry White, when he was a 18-year-old freshman, sophomore at Brown University, decided that he was going to, over the summer, follow the paths of the prophets through a hiking trip through the Middle East with some buddies of his. And so he was in the area around the Golan Heights, and unfortunately went into an area that had landmines. And he didn't read Hebrew, so he didn't see the signs that said, don't go in this area, there are landmines. And unfortunately, Jerry stepped on a landmine, and it blew off the lower part of his leg. And he was at risk for losing his life because he was bleeding profusely, and his friends, at great personal risk, went into the landmine area and carried him out and took him to safety and got him to a hospital where he started his recovery. He ended up losing the leg, and he was in an Israeli hospital and was feeling very sorry for himself, losing a leg, being a young man. His mother said to him, why are you staying in an Israeli hospital when you can come home and go to a great hospital like Mass General in Boston? And Jerry told his mother that the Israelis, they know how to handle this problem. But he was still feeling very depressed. And at one point he told me a story, this story, where he was feeling depressed, when an Israeli soldier walked by his bed and said to him, what leg do you think I lost? And Jerry said to the soldier, it doesn't look like you lost any leg. And the soldier said, I've lost both my legs. And then he said to Jerry, do you have your knee? And if you have a knee after you've lost a leg, it helps with rehabilitation. And Jerry said he still had his knee. And then the soldier said, don't worry, it's like a nose cold. And that set Jerry on his road to recovery. And that soldier, who he didn't know very well in the beginning, ultimately became a role model for him. And having role models is part of the pathway to becoming more resilient. But in addition, Jerry decided ultimately to do something about landmines. And he devoted much of the rest of his life up to the present time to trying to rid the planet of landmines. And with Ken Rutherford, who's in the next slide, who's on the left side of the slide, Jerry co-founded the Landmine Survivors Network that ultimately was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1997. And you can also see here a picture of Princess Diana, who ended up getting very involved in the Landmine Survivors Network. So there are several messages from Jerry's story, who's ultimately become a good friend of mine. His role models are important, and having a personal moral compass and a purpose in life that can emanate from a trauma can be very useful in a road toward recovery and enhancing resilience. Here's another person we met along the way. In fact, I know this person, Deborah Gruen, since she was very young. I knew her father. She was born with spina bifida, which many of you may know is a congenital disorder of the spinal cord that can result in short stature and difficulty with certain bodily functions. It can be quite disabling. But Deborah, from early in life, and my own kids babysat for her, was an optimistic, can-do person. Genetically, she was born that way. And she was never going to let this disability get her down. When she was a young girl, she decided to swim. Swam on some swim teams during the summer with able-bodied individuals and never gave up. Long story made short, ultimately she became a gold medalist as a para-Olympian, graduated valedictorian from her high school class, went to Yale, swam on the swim team at Yale as on the varsity, even though she couldn't keep up with the other swimmers, but the coach wanted her on the team because she was a role model to others. Key feature about, and Deborah now has gone on to law school and is very accomplished, but the key element related to resilience about Deborah was optimism, can do, facing the brutal facts of what you had to deal with, but having the attitude that I will prevail. We also got to know another group of individuals, and those were the POWs from Vietnam. We ended up, Steve Southwick and I, interviewing over 30 POWs from Vietnam. We started out with a blank slate in our own mind in terms of what were the key features of resilience. We wanted to learn from them, and ultimately they gave us clues to what resilience is all about that we ended up studying in greater detail. We chose the POWs because we had heard that despite being held in prison for 6 to 8 years and being heavily tortured, that many of them went on to very successful lives. And John McCain is the most famous example. So we wanted to learn, how do you handle the trauma and stress of being a POW 8,000 miles away from home and come out the other end a very strong and accomplished person. So like I said, we interviewed many of them. Let me tell you a little bit about what being a POW was like. What you see in this slide is a schematic of the prison in Hanoi, which was nicknamed the Hanoi Hilton by one of the POWs we got to know, Admiral Shoemaker. And there were different elements of the prison where people were held. That's detailed on the slide. And you'll see here in these pictures, these drawings by John McGrath, who was a POW for 6 years, what it was like to be a POW. Many of the POWs were held in solitary confinement for years. Can you imagine that? Solitary confinement, where you weren't allowed to speak and you were held in a small cell by yourself. They were physically tortured in a number of different ways that resulted in significant injury. One of the most difficult tortures was called the ropes, which is depicted in this drawing, and frequently through the pressure that the ropes placed on the shoulders, that there was bilateral dislocation of the shoulders. Another example of the physical torture that they went through. And many times when they were held in solitary confinement, they were also restrained, as detailed in this picture. And they were waterboarded. And this is an example of what waterboarding is about, where you're held, your head is lower than your feet, and you get the sensation of drowning with water, being placed around your face. Now, one of the key things that we learned that enabled the POWs to get through all this was a tap code. And they were able to, they devised a way to communicate to each other through the wall so that even though they were in solitary confinement and were not allowed to speak, they could communicate. And they described to us how very intense, intimate, ultimately lifelong friendships were developed through this kind of communication through the wall. And you can see here the prisoner tapping on the wall and listening using that cup for return tapping. And what's pictured here is literally the tap code, which shows 5 rows of 5 letters. And so if you tapped once, that would tell you it was row 1. And then if you followed that with a tap of 3 times, that would be the letter, the 3rd letter in that row, C. So that's how they were able to spell out words. And when we asked them to illustrate this to us even many years later, they were very facile in tapping out words using abbreviations and so forth. And they told us that without this tap code and being able to communicate, develop friendships and support systems through this manner, that they would not have really been able to survive psychologically. And what Steve and I use as an analogy related to resilience is that everybody needs a tap code. Everybody needs meaningful friendships and support systems to get through tough times. We also found that from them that physical exercise was very important as it relates to resilience. They detailed what they would do in their cell to keep in physical shape, and they thought that was very important to their self-esteem. And as I'll describe in a few moments, a number of the POWs tried to use getting in great physical shape, even in an 8x8 cell, to attempt to escape. And we now know from lots of science that physical exercise is useful for brain health through mechanisms such as neurogenesis and the enhancement of neurogrowth factors. There was a particular part of the Hanoi Hilton that was nicknamed by the prisoners Camp Alcatraz, and that was reserved for the most, I'd say, courageous of the POWs who withstood the most torture. And Steve Southwick and I ended up having the privilege of interviewing many of these POWs that were held in Camp Alcatraz. Jim Stockdale was perhaps the most heroic of the POWs. He won the Medal of Honor by being the senior officer among the POWs. Samuel Johnson, whose name is listed here on the right, ended up becoming a congressman from Texas. Bob Shoemaker, right underneath there, became an admiral. We got to know Bob Shoemaker very well. Tanner is known for a very famous story where the prisoners were heavily tortured and were forced to go on TV to just talk propaganda, and they really didn't want to do that. But they were at risk to being tortured to death if they didn't. And there was one moment where Tanner was being asked to go on TV that, would go around the world to say things that weren't true, and he didn't want to go there. And so he described to us praying about what should he do, and he ended up going on TV that got broadcast around the world. And when they asked him who his squadron leader was, he said Clark Kent, which of course was not his squadron leader. But the Vietnamese did not know that Clark Kent was Superman, and that gave the message to the Americans that they were really being tortured and things were not so good in the POW camp. Jeremiah Denton, on the bottom, became a senator from Alabama. So we learned a lot from the POWs, and it helped us kind of organize and ultimately, along with many of the other people we got to meet, devise and uncover a series of factors that relate to resilience. This is a little description of Bob Shoemaker, who we got to know quite well. Ultimately, when he got out, became an admiral. This is a very famous picture of when Bob literally got off the plane after being held from February 11th, 1965, when he was the second airman shot down, to February 12th, 1973, when he was released from prison, when he was first seeing his wife, Lorraine, and his son. His son ultimately became a neurosurgeon. This is Bob when we interviewed him, and he told us a lot about the TAP code, which he helped develop, and the importance of how that helped him get through tough times. He also talked about the importance of maintaining a sense of humor during the darkest of days. So this is some of the factors that we think relate to a prescription to become a more resilient person. And optimism is very important. Having a positive attitude sounds trivial, but it's really hard. Optimism is strongly correlated with resilience, and I'll show you some other studies that support that. And there's really no doubt that optimism is in part genetic, that there are genes that are going to be related to optimism, but genes are not destiny, and you can make yourself more optimistic. In fact, you might make the case that cognitive behavioral therapy, which is useful for depression and PTSD, is one means to enhance realistic optimism. And this I think, is a great example of really true optimism. Pollyanna optimism, unrealistic optimism, is not good. That gets you in trouble. This is a term that Jim Collins, who writes a lot about how to make institutions great, it's called the Stockdale paradox, and it's based on Jim Stockdale, the POW I mentioned before, who was so heroic, and basically makes the case that Pollyanna optimism is not the way to go, that a truly optimistic person confronts the brutal facts of their current reality, whatever they may be. That you want to accurately assess what the trauma is, what you have to face, but at the same time, you have the confidence to retain faith that you will prevail in the end, regardless of the difficulties. That is the optimism that you need to be resilient. And we've looked at this in a number of different ways. When I gave a talk to a NYU a number of years ago, there was a psychiatrist in the audience, Dr. Ahmed, who got inspired by the idea of resilience, and he was Pakistani, and he decided that he wanted to understand how people in Pakistan were able to recover from a very serious earthquake in northwest Pakistan that literally had killed approximately 250,000 people. So we collaborated on a project where he went to this remote area of Pakistan to study the survivors of this earthquake. And this is obviously a very different cultural group than we had studied previously. They did not speak English, and they spoke Urdu, which Dr. Ahmed spoke, and we translated certain scales to that language. And he went there and interviewed these people and assessed how they were doing, and he found that optimism and higher scores on the Connor-Davidson resilience scale were significantly associated with lower symptom levels. So optimism may be, in a sense, a universal feature related to resilience regardless of culture of origin. Another key feature that we found related to resilience is what we call cognitive flexibility through cognitive reappraisal. And that is traumatic experiences can be reevaluated by altering the perceived value and meaningfulness of the event. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. The hardest wood is that burnt by fire. And you can become stronger and even receive a benefit from stress or trauma if you can reframe it, assimilate it into understanding who you are, accept it, and recover. We've heard over and over again that failure literally is an essential ingredient for growth. And we now understand some of the neurobiologic mechanisms that might underlie cognitive flexibility and cognitive reappraisal in terms of mechanisms that relate to memory reconsolidation, cognitive control of emotion, memory suppression, and so forth. In addition, another key factor relates to having a strong moral compass, a set of beliefs that very few things can shatter. Now, for many of the people we met, it was faith in the traditional sense, being religious. But in others, it was a more non-religious but important spiritual belief, or having a moral compass or a purpose in life that helped you get through tough times. We also found that altruism is strongly related to resilience, survivor mission. And this is an example of what Jerry White did, that he decided that he was going to devote his life to removing landmines from the earth. He's truly altruistic. So we were able to study these factors in a more objective way. We studied a group of African Americans who were living in inner city Washington, D.C., in great poverty, and also facing constant challenges of physical abuse, being the victims of criminal behavior, and so forth. And in this group, we found a number of things emerged as key factors related to resilience, which is consistent with what we had learned. And in this case, it was purpose in life. It was strongly associated with the resilience and recovery from trauma. And you can measure purpose in life with a scale developed by Carol Riff, and the resilient group had a much higher measurement of a strong purpose in life than did the group that remained ill following trauma. And the group that was able to recover from trauma had an intermediate level. We also found in this population that attending religious services frequently was strongly associated with recovery and resilience. And many things may relate to this. By being part of a religious group, you get support, which is another factor related to resilience, and also a strong sense of purpose in life. Here are some of the other factors we learned. Number 4, find a resilient role model. And in fact, it's finding resilient role models in the plural. Role models can be found in one's own life, like your parents, or even in people you don't know that are inspirational, that may have had a similar challenge that you're facing yourself. Imitation is a very powerful mode of learning, and here we have begun to understand the basis of imitation, imprinting, and role models. We heard a lot about this from the POWs. Stephen Long was one who described to us how when they were in prison, they took the other POWs as role models. And in fact, many of the POWs were offered early release, but they said that none of us are going to go until we all go together. And so they were role models for each other in getting through those tough times. This is Steve White when he was talking to us later in life. Facing your fears. We learned a lot about facing your fears when we studied a group of Navy SEALs and who are the Special Forces of the Navy, as well as the Green Berets, which are the U.S. Special Forces in the Army. And you might think that courage is the absence of fear, but that's not true at all. Courage is the ability to experience fear, but move beyond it. And they described to us how fear is normal and can be used as a guide. For somebody who's a traumatized person, that means you can't let the trauma overcome you and restrict your life. So that if you're a woman that has unfortunately been a victim of sexual abuse, you can't let that stop you from then moving on in your life and developing important relationships and so forth. And facing your fears can increase your self-esteem. And we know a lot about the neurobiology of fear and extinction of fear. and even stress inoculation, where low levels of stress can help you over time deal with higher levels of stress. Terry Cole, pictured here, was one of the U.S. Special Forces that revealed a lot of this to us, because we asked him about the training. That, you know, how do you train to go in harm's way when almost nobody else will go there? You know, like the Navy SEALs that went to capture Osama bin Laden. And he described to us, you know, how they taught people to jump out of airplanes in the middle of the night into a dangerous territory. And he said you started out kind of one step at a time, teaching people how to overcome fear of heights, ultimately jumping out of airplanes at low altitude, but then ultimately, you know, have to jump out of an airplane in the middle of the night in dangerous territory. And he said at some point, even after all the training, you just have to do it. And that's helpful sometimes in telling your patients that. Sometimes you do just have to do it and face your fears. Here are two more important elements related to a resilience prescription. As I mentioned already, the supportive social network, very important. Everybody needs a tap code to get through tough times. Very few can go it alone. You get enormous emotional strength from relationships between people and organizations. Mothers Against Drunk Driving, you know, help mothers who's lost a child. We know lots of advocacy organizations that help patients face cancer, breast cancer. These are incredibly important supportive social networks. And for those of us who treat psychiatric patients with chronic mental illness, we need more of such organizations, and they can be a safety net during times of stress. And here, too, we know a lot about the biology. We know a lot about the neuroscience of social behavior, for example. And I also mentioned earlier attention to physical well-being. We know that physical exercises contributes to physical and mental hardiness, improved mood, and self-esteem. The biology of this has begun to be fairly well established, including neurogenesis. The making of new brain cells in places like the hippocampus is enhanced by physical exercise, and that results in improvement in cognition and the regulation of emotion. And many of the studies that we ultimately conducted in other populations supported these elements. For example, in a study involving returning veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan, we found that those who ultimately were screened positive for PTSD had greater problems in relationships, less cohesion in their family, less social support, poorer social functioning. And the converse is more social support, better relationships result in a lower degree percentage of individuals who ultimately develop PTSD. And we found this in another study, you know, similar findings in a group of veterans. So you find these kinds of these associations ranging from inner city victims of physical abuse, victims of earthquakes in remote regions of the world, and veterans coming back from war. This is another POW that we got to know very well that really captured the importance of physical exercise. Lou Mayer was taking POW while being a fireman in Vietnam, not an active soldier, but he would help put out fires associated with our troops, and he was taking POW. And he was held with another prisoner, Bill Thompson, for many years, and they both together decided that they were going to try to escape from the Hanoi Hilton. So they worked very hard to get in physical shape. And this is Lou when he was telling us these stories, where they ended up running 24 hours without stopping in the cell, doing what he called the JFK-12, which is a set of calisthenics that was popularized when President Kennedy was in office. And ultimately, they did escape, but unfortunately then were recaptured and heavily tortured. But Lou was a role model and hero to many of the other POWs. When he got out, after being a POW for about 5 years, he went back to San Diego and was the fire chief for that city for 30 years. And when we met him, he had just retired from being fire chief. And the last two elements of the prescription make the point that you can train regularly in multiple areas to become a more resilient person, and that can help such things as your emotional intelligence, your moral integrity, your physical endurance. And you should learn to recognize what are your signature strengths, what can you do best, because you don't have to develop all of these factors. You can pick a few that fit you in terms of what your strengths are and what can you engage in to ultimately help you deal with difficult and stressful situations. Now let me talk a little bit about what we as a field have learned about the development of resilience. And we know that early physical and sexual abuse is associated with long-lasting changes in the brain. They essentially result in a set point of biological changes in the brain that can result in a greater vulnerability to developing stress-related disorders. We also have learned that resilience to early life stress can be enhanced by a number of factors based on studies in children who were orphans. A very famous study involved children who were adopted away from institutional orphanages in Romania, and they found that those children who did best were able to attract a caring adult, had innate ability in social competence, and an innate capacity for self-reflection and self-regulation. This is a very important concept, and that is stress inoculation. David Lyons has done a lot of great work in this from Stanford University. And what he has found, and this is now being applied in clinical populations, is that exposure to manageable levels of stress during development can result in more adaptive methods of dealing with more serious stress later in life. So that in my own life, this has that implications for how I even raised my children. That I felt that if you raise children in a stress-free life, they're not prepared what's going to happen later. But that if you place them in contexts that are out of their comfort zone, but are manageable, they develop essentially a psychological toolbox for developing a capacity to handle more serious stress in their life. And a story that I've given my daughter, one of my daughters gave me permission to talk about as an example was I used to take my kids on serious hikes, somewhat dangerous, not seriously dangerous, but a little anxiety-provoking, into the wilderness. And one time, one of my daughters, when she was 13, when we were a little bit lost and we're trying to find our way, she said to me that she despised me. Now, I might have backed off and said, I'm going to stop doing that, but I felt, I need to make her more comfortable in situations that are a bit stressful. So we continued that kind of activity. And what did she do last year as a 30-year-old mother? She went to Yellowstone in winter. So you can use the concepts of stress inoculation to ultimately make people more stress resistant. And this is an example of the concept of post-traumatic growth, that you can grow as an individual even if you've been traumatized. There's a scale, the post-traumatic growth inventory that we gave to our POWs, and they showed a lot of post-traumatic growth as a consequence of being a prisoner for many years. And we found that the more post-traumatic growth that the POWs experienced was pretty strongly correlated with the level of innate dispositional optimism that they had, which you can also measure with a well-validated scale called the LOT, the LOT. When we asked Tom Collins, who was one of the POWs, would you like to have erased the POW experience? Basically, this is what he said: in the total sense of my life, it's probably been a good experience. I wouldn't erase the experience because I got benefits out of it. In fact, I can't erase it. I can't go back and change it. But frankly, it left permanently more good things in my life than it did bad things. Pain creates character. It happened, but you can take advantage of the good thing. You learn how to get through the hard things. You become tougher emotionally. It's a good definition of post-traumatic growth. In the last few minutes of my talk, I'd like to cover a little bit of biology, and then we'll take questions. There's been a lot of work recently to essentially uncover what are the genetic factors related to resilience. Studies have shown that specific genes related to the HPA stress axis are related to resilience on one hand and vulnerability on the other. And the same is true for neuropeptide Y, BDNF, which is a growth factor in the brain, and the serotonin transporter. I'm going to skip these two slides. We've also been able to, through lots of research, identify some of the neurochemicals that are related to resilience on one hand and vulnerability to psychopathology on the other. That includes the brain norepinephrine system, which is overactive in anxiety and reduced responsiveness under stress and resilience. I mentioned neuropeptide Y, which is a naturally occurring neuropeptide. Low neuropeptide Y is related to stress vulnerability, whereas increases seem to relate to resilience. As two examples. I mentioned cortisol, DHEA, CRH, all related to resilience when CRH is high. I mean, when CRH is high or high levels of cortisol could be more related to psychopathology. DHEA, which is a naturally occurring anti-glucocorticoid, has been shown to be increased in resilient behavior. The 5-H, the serotonin transporter gene, is probably most relevant to resilience based on a lot of studies. And what you can see from this slide is that, one, we know that severe maltreatment is associated with a vulnerability to depression. That's a known epidemiologic fact. But if you have one form of the serotonin transporter gene, the LL form, which is shown here on this slide, there is no relationship between severe maltreatment and the probability of getting depressed. So the LL form of the serotonin transporter gene relates to resilience. We conducted a study in the Special Forces to look at the neurochemical response to severe stress. This course is called Surviving, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape, and it's literally where the Special Forces are taken into a mock POW camp and are interrogated physically and emotionally. And we were able to determine what were the neurochemical factors that related to how well they did during this very serious training exercise. And this is some pictures of the exercise. And you can see how realistic the POW camp is. And what we found is that under this stress of taking being a mock POW, cortisol went up dramatically, as shown in this slide. Levels of norepinephrine went up dramatically. Neuropeptide Y went up, but testosterone went down, as you can see. and DHEA went up. Now we wanted to see what related to the clinical response. Before I show you that, we conducted the same experiment in Navy SEALs in their survival school and found under the stress of their survival school, same neurochemical pattern emerged, cortisol, neuropeptide Y, and norepinephrine going up. In both groups, the Navy SEALs and the Army Special Forces, we found what related to a positive performance under the stress. The higher the DHEA levels related to cortisol, the better the Army Special Forces performed under stress. And in both the Army and the Navy SEALs, the higher the neuropeptide Y went under stress, the better they performed. And as a result of this work and other work related to neuropeptide Y, my research group here at Mount Sinai is now working to develop neuropeptide Y as a possible treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. And a lot of the work that's been done in this area to map out the neurochemistry of resilience and vulnerability is shown on this slide. That we've been able to relate the neurochemical systems that I've mentioned to specific brain areas that mediate anxiety, fear, and mood disturbances, including the hippocampus, the amygdala, the hypothalamus, the prefrontal cortex. So this provides us a bit of a roadmap to develop novel biologically related treatments to enhance our resilience. And ultimately, we have put together a somewhat of a roadmap based on the factors that I mentioned earlier in my talk, and that is starting with role models when you're faced with severe challenges, using a moral compass, the ability to cognitively reappraise the trauma. Spirituality and religion can be helpful. Ultimately, optimism is a key factor to getting through tough times, and that enables you to marshal social support, enables you to face your fears, and along with using exercise, ultimately having an active coping style that results in being more resilient. I'm not going to go through this, but if you're interested in how this might relate to novel approaches to the treatment of depression, Steve Southwick and I had an article a couple of months ago in Science that relates this to using resilience training involving the factors that I mentioned to ultimately promote resilience, which we think can help stress-related depression. And finally, here are some pictures that motivate me. This is a group of first responders working to save people during Hurricane Katrina. This is a fireman on 9/11/2001 going up the towers when everybody else is going down. So work hard to understand, what enables an individual to do such things. And ultimately, I have a little bit of a reading list if those of you who are interested in this topic. These are two books that I love that exemplify resilience and courage. The Lewis and Clark Expedition, The Core of Discovery. Stephen Ambrose's book is great. And, the Shackleton Expedition, South with Endurance is another great book. And a lot of what I've talked about today is in this textbook that Steve Southwick, Brett Litz, myself, and Matt Friedman edited, and also a book that Steve Southwick and I published earlier this year on resilience, which goes through a lot of the things that I've discussed today. So thank you very much for your attention.
Dennis, thank you very much, certainly for this excellent presentation and also for all the work that you're doing on this very important topic. You've actually answered a lot of the questions as they sort of came in earlier. You covered so many of the questions, but we have time for a couple of questions. And one specifically, and you gave an example of what you did to help encourage resilience in your own children, but one is what more can people do to encourage resilience in their children as they're raising them?
Well, one is, like I mentioned, and that is you don't want to raise your children in a stress-free environment, because then they won't be prepared. Now, that doesn't mean to abuse your children, but it means to put them in situations that are a bit out of their comfort zone. Whether it's like in my case, taking my family of 5 kids into wilderness areas and working together on how to thrive in that environment. But it might be so many other things, whether it's performing an instrument or competing in competitive sports. I'm sure you can think of many different ways that you can challenge your children so they develop skills that can enhance their resilience. So I found that very helpful. Now, obviously, being in a very supportive environment is key, and that's where the TAP code idea comes in. In some cases, right, getting them involved in religious activities can be very helpful. See, many of these factors are pertinent to how you might raise your children.
And then, again, along those lines, related to children and related to resilience, there were a few questions about the tragic loss of a child and how the parent copes with that. Yeah. I wanted to ask if you could say a few words about that.
Yeah, and there's almost nothing more traumatic than losing a child. What has been shown to be helpful is to, in a way, do what Jerry White, did around landmines and his response to his own amputation, and that is to do something about it. So that if you lose, Mothers Against Drunk Driving is an example where mothers who lost a child to a drunk driver said, I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to give back. I'm going to be altruistic. I'm going to change the situation that resulted in my losing a child. That helps in the healing process. If you lost a child, from an illness, a lot of parents will then work to develop a foundation that works to discover a cure for that illness. The Jed Foundation, which was formed by the parents of Jed, who was unfortunately a boy in college who committed suicide. Well, the Jed Foundation was formed by his parents and his sibling to help prevent suicide among college students. So those are the kind of things a parent can do to help with the healing process.
That's all very, very good guidance for people. There's a question related to you're describing changes in the brain as a result of abuse, early childhood abuse.
Yep. And
the question is, with proper treatment, can those changes be reversed?
I think they can, because a very important area of current neuroscience relates to neuroplasticity. And what that literally means is that the brain, biology of the brain is not fixed, that it's still very responsive to the world around it. We know that certain kind of psychological tasks can change brain function. We know that medicine, antidepressant medicines and other medicines, can alter the biology of the brain and literally reverse the neural abnormality in neural circuits and neurochemistry in the brain. So the changes that might occur as a result of early child abuse, I think, are eminently reversible. A really profound example that we experienced through our research of brain plasticity was when the POWs were held in solitary confinement, and all they could do was think. They developed enhanced cognitive capacities that they never had before. Their ability to learn and remember and do very difficult calculations was enhanced when they were in solitary confinement. And we now know, through subsequent research, some of which my own group is now doing, that certain practicing certain tasks can enhance cognition through a non-pharmacological means.
Right. We know when you and I went to medical school, we were taught that old brains don't grow new cells, and old meant after the age of 2 or 3. Yep. And we now know that's not true.
Well, I'm particularly motivated to change that now.
Yeah. I want to ask you a little bit more about the issue of optimism, and again, how to have that healthy optimism.
Yeah, I find that really important. People are born, I think, with a certain set point on the optimism scale, dimensionally. You know, that there are some people who are incurably optimistic, and those are fun people to be around, except when they're not facing the facts. And as I mentioned, the most helpful optimism is the ability to face facts but still think you're going to prevail. Cognitive behavioral therapy, which is designed for people who are overly pessimistic, who have a negative bias toward things, is literally to confront them with the facts that things aren't so bad, that you can be optimistic, that you can accomplish things that you thought you couldn't do. So we know people who are somewhat inherently pessimistic or negative about things, that you can change that through approaches like cognitive therapy and mindfulness training and so forth.
Finally, you spoke a little bit about some of the research and the future. What do you see as the next big discoveries in this area? And I'm sure you and your group will be a part of that. But what 5 years from now, 10 years from now, where do you see the field with regards to this?
I think that the work in resilience that now many people are doing can have implications for the development of new forms of psychotherapy. That when I was trained in psychotherapy, a lot of the factors that we uncovered related to resilience were not part of that. Religion, faith, purpose in life was not, focused on as much as I think it could be. Cognitive reappraisal, developing optimism. So I think it has, in the paper that we published in Science, we talk a little bit more about that, how to utilize this kind of research that we know relates to stress resilience can be incorporated into more standard approaches to psychotherapy. And then there is the biology, and as I mentioned, my own group, which revealed through some clinical studies that neuropeptide Y seemed to be related to resilience. Well, we're now seeing if we give neuropeptide Y, whether that can enhance, be a new form of pharmacological treatment of PTSD. So I think the future holds optimism for both developing new therapies, but both in terms of pharmacology and therapy.
Well, I agree with you, and I want to again thank you for the work that you've done and for this extremely informative presentation. Certainly your work offers tremendous hope and a path for people to grow stronger despite adversity. And I want to thank you for sharing this with us today.
Thank you very much.
I also want to thank I also want to thank our audience for joining us today. The Foundation, through its research grants, is dedicated to improving the lives of people with psychiatric conditions. And I want to thank our audience for joining us on that mission. All of the research that we fund is made possible through private donations. So if you'd like to make a gift, please visit bbrfoundation.org or call 1-800-829-8289. The webinar has been recorded, so if you missed any portion of this presentation or would like to share it with a family or friend, please visit our webinar page on the website. And I want to invite people to join us next month when we'll hear from Dr. Carlos Zarate. Dr. Zarate is a NARSAD grantee and is the chief of the section on neurobiology and treatment of mood disorders and of experimental therapeutics and pathophysiology at the National Institute of Mental Health. He'll speak to us about rapid-acting antidepressants and the next generation of therapies. That will take place on Tuesday, August 13th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Once again, thank you, Dr. Charney. Thank you, audience, for joining us. And I'm looking forward to our next webinar in August. Take care, everybody.